This is the United Podcast Network.
Welcome to Spouses Talking Houses with husband and wife real estate team Jennifer and Brian Frost. Everything you want to know about buying, selling, investing, and owning property. So let's get real about real estate.
Welcome back to Spouses Talking Houses. I'm Jennifer.
I'm Brian.
And today we are going to get real about property disclosures. That's a real sexy topic, huh?
Oh, yes, definitely.
I'm going to try to make it interesting. It's interesting to me.
Disclose.
But before we get to that, let's just talk a little bit about our real estate lifestyle. I took the day yesterday and volunteered at the polls in Londonderry as a ballot clerk. First time I ever did that.
You are a better person than I.
It was pretty easy. It was kind of interesting.
Did you see me come in and vote?
No, I did not.
Oh, I must have missed you.
Yeah, that's because it's the primaries and we don't really know who anybody is in the primaries.
Nobody knows and no one cares. It's unfortunate, but that's the real.
But they have quite a system, and then because of COVID, everything had to be spaced out and
sanitized. Every few minutes.
Yeah, everything was getting wiped down, but there were just we had cases of pens, so we're just giving people individual pens.
So how were the crowds?
They were pretty steady when I was there. I was there from 11:45 till 5:30.
Oh, see, I was in at 11:30.
There was a little bit of a lunch rush, and then things definitely picked up right around 4.
Okay.
But yeah, it was interesting, and I had to go to a training the week before with a bunch of other people, obviously, and get sworn in. So that was interesting. I have no idea what this swear-in oath was. I read it and said yes, and that was it. Yeah. But I'll be doing it again November 3rd for the general election, and that's going to be crazy.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah,
that'll be quite the turnout. Yeah.
Well, you would think.
Yeah.
So.
And so anyway, so that's what I was up to.
I've been prepping. We have a couple of listings coming on this weekend, so I've been working on that. I did make an awesome beer can chicken over the weekend.
Yes.
A little too spicy, but it was cooked perfectly. So.
I know, it was juicy, and the skin was perfectly browned and caramelized, and you glazed it and whatever. What did you do that made it so hot?
It was just the rub. I had never used the rub. It was a new rub, so I just...
Okay.
Yeah, just a little too much.
Just a little too much.
Live and learn.
Live and learn.
So.
All right, so now we're going to talk about property disclosure. I'm going to stick with New Hampshire just because when I start to cross states on some of these forms, that doesn't always make sense. So...
But Massachusetts does have similar forms.
Yeah, Massachusetts has similar forms.
Which they are not required to.
I think they still are required. It's just they don't customarily do them.
Oh, okay.
So that's...
I learned something today.
All
right.
So the property disclosure form from the New Hampshire Association of Realtors is 4 pages long. It is assumed by a lot of realtors and buyers and sellers to be a required form. It is not required by law. A lot of the questions on it are required by law, and that's one of the reasons why we use the form. But this particular format does not have to be, you don't have to use this particular form.
Right. There's certain disclosures that you have to do, whether it's on a form or some other.
Exactly. So the first disclosure law in New Hampshire was in 1990, and that was in regards to radon, arsenic, and lead paint. And of course, lead paint disclosures are taken extremely seriously.
Sure.
All over the country, and for good reason. Then the following year, they added septic systems. So
before you move on, so when do I have to disclose about lead? Or
when the house was built prior to 1978. Okay. And then, so then the next thing that was added to the law for disclosure requirement from the seller to the buyer was regarding septic systems. And then next would be water supply. So if prior to the execution of any contract for the purchase and sale agreement for property, which includes a building, the seller shall disclose the type of water supply system, its location, malfunctions, date of installation, date of most recent water test, and whether or not the seller has experienced a problem. And then regarding the sewage disposal system, size of the tank, type of system, location, malfunctions, age, date it was most recently serviced, and the name of the contractor who services the system. So those questions are on the disclosure form, but I don't see most people answer all of those questions.
Yeah, they generally don't give a lot of detail. And
they don't always know. I mean, if you're in a 40-year-old house, like I don't know who installed our septic system in our house.
No, because, well...
We're like the fifth or sixth owner.
It's original. I mean, you could look up the documents maybe and find out who installed it, so...
Which is a good thing that Brian usually does. He goes down to the town hall on our listings and gets a copy of the septic design if it is on file and a copy of the septic permit so that we do have that information to give to the buyer.
I mean, it's a state... The state really oversees the septic systems, but the towns usually do have them on file.
Yeah, from about mid-'80s forward.
Right. Once you get past a certain date, that they're not going to have anything on file.
Yeah.
So.
And the state of New Hampshire also has a subsurface something query that I go on to, and I can see the dates that something was approved.
Okay.
And then again, from like the mid-'80s forward typically. And then for the really recent stuff in the last handful of years, I can actually get a PDF copy of that stuff that you're getting at Town Hall.
Okay, sure.
So sometimes I can get that online. Anyway, then the next thing is disclosures required for multifamily properties. And then here, history of the property. So the owner of a property shall not be required to disclose that the property was a site of a homicide, other felony, or a suicide, unless the buyer requests such information of the owner.
Did you say suicide?
Suicide?
I'm just kidding.
Suicide. Unless the buyer requests such information and the owner or agent has knowledge. So
if you're asked about it, you have to divulge it.
Yeah, and I think that goes for everything. If you're asked about something, you can't lie.
But you can lie if they don't ask.
You can stay silent if they don't ask.
Plead the fifth.
Then there's a condominium disclosure that is required. Then methamphetamine.
That's recent.
It was a recent one.
And that was actually added to the form, right?
Yes, that was added to the form, and it was added to the land form as well, because Breaking Bad style, people cook meth out in the woods, I guess.
I wouldn't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't know either, other than watching TV.
Yeah, and that was mostly in the desert.
And then there's a new one. There's a new one as of 2010 in regards to solar panels. If they are leased or rented, that information has to be given to the buyer.
Very important.
Very important in all of the terms. So, and I don't think I see that on our updated form. So maybe I've got to have a conversation with somebody on the forms committee at NHAR. So anyway, so typically what will happen is the property disclosure is filled out by the seller when they list the property. And the seller should be answering those questions of anything that they have actual knowledge of or paperwork of, but they should not be guessing.
Oh, I totally agree. And that's something that I always say. If you don't know, don't guess.
Right, don't guess. Don't guess. And the other thing is sometimes sellers will ask us to help them fill out the questionnaire, and our errors and omissions insurance people do not like that at all.
Of course.
They want the seller to do it themselves,
right?
Which is fine, except that there are a couple of things that they tend to misunderstand and answer wrong. One of them being, is the property in current use?
Sure.
So that's under general information. And are you receiving a tax exemption for this property for any reason, but not limited to current use, land conservation, etc., yes or no? And then after that, it says, is any part of this property in current use? Well, that's a question that's referring to the previous tax exemption,
sure.
And current use is the name of a tax exemption. But most people just say, yes, we're currently using the property, and check that off as yes.
So it's a good idea to go through some of these items just to make sure that it's filled out correctly.
Exactly. And if you buy a bank-owned property, it'll usually just have a big X across it and says we've never occupied the property, so that they're providing you with the form, but it's a useless form.
Right. They're covering themselves.
Yeah. And then occasionally we have like estate sales, probate type things. And so there's a question at the beginning that says the seller has or has not occupied the property.
And for how long?
And for how long, yeah. So if the seller has not occupied the property, they can check that off. But they may have some knowledge of the age of the heating system.
It's true, they may.
Et cetera, yeah. So the very first couple of questions are about water and sewer, which are really important if you've got private water and sewer. And if you've had any water tests, what's the age of the leach field? What's the size of your tank? And then they also throw in there that if the property is on developed waterfront, has a site assessment been done? And I usually just pull the New Hampshire fact sheet about site assessments and give that out to people who are selling or buying waterfront property.
Okay.
Number 7 is about insulation. Most people, unless they did it themselves or had the house built and saw it, have no idea what kind of insulation they have.
And it's usually assumed, but unless you've taken all the wallboard off and looked at it between all the studs, you don't know.
You don't know, yes, like what type it is and how many inches it is and all of that. Yeah.
And then, of course, if we're dealing with an antique home and they know there's no insulation in the house because they've lived there through a winter.
Right. Or it might just be crumpled up newspapers in the walls.
It could be, yeah.
So underground storage tanks, we run into that with both oil and propane, but not oil for a long time.
Nope. And we actually had one removed from our first purchase in Derry. So. Yeah. And the seller who was an attorney didn't want to pull the tank.
Didn't want the liability. Yeah.
Didn't want the liability, so we took the chance. And what did we do it the week after we closed?
The day after. I think I scheduled it the day after we closed.
We definitely had our fingers crossed that there was no leakage, oil leakage in the contaminants in the ground, because that would have cost a pretty penny to remediate, depending on how much.
Yeah. So in the 70s, when oil was very expensive, it was popular for people to replace their 275-gallon oil tank that was in the house with was it 1,000?
I think it was 1,000.
I think it was a 1,000-gallon tank buried underground. And that's what we ran into with our house, because then people would fill it up in the summer when the prices were cheaper, and they'd have enough to last them through the whole winter. Most of them at this point have been removed. It's been a long time since I've seen a house that had one in place.
Yep.
If you're looking for records on an underground storage tank removal, usually it's the fire department in the town, because they came out and supervised.
Yeah, they made sure it was done right, and they wanted to actually see it.
And ours happened to be in nice, clean sand, but if they had seen any oil, any oil that had leaked into the surrounding area, that's when
the problem arises.
That's when the problem arises, exactly. And the cost to pressure test the tank to see if it leaked versus removing it at the time was about the same.
Yeah.
And now nobody would pressure test it.
And we just wanted to deal with it, get it done with, and move on.
Yeah. If you have an underground propane tank, that's a little bit of a different story. Sometimes those are owned by the individual owner of the house, but most of the time they're leased, and they're owned by the propane company.
And they lease them back and forth if you switch companies, generally.
Generally, exactly. Yep. And so they're responsible for the maintenance of it, and
which is a good thing. And if something goes wrong, it's their problem.
Right. But I think the big thing here is if the tank is no longer in use, has it been removed? That's a pretty important question.
Right.
Yeah. Asbestos is another question. I used to see that when I started out, and I worked in the Worcester area, and there were a lot of homes that had been built around 1900, multifamilies, and they had those big octopus furnaces, and they were all covered with the white asbestos insulation. But we don't see that too much anymore, except in the siding, the asbestos shingles.
Right, because most of that's been removed by now,
or covered up.
Yeah,
encapsulated. Encapsulated is typically what they do. Yeah.
And the same with the siding.
Yeah. Then there's disclosures for radon in the air, radon in the water. There is a question here about lead-based paint, even though we have a separate lead-based paint.
Sure.
disclosure. On the lead disclosure, by the way, there's a question that every time I go to a continuing ed class, this comes up, and the answer is always the same, and I will never understand it. I kind of understand, but I'll never understand it. On the lead paint disclosure, it asks the seller, do you have any records? Or actually, the seller checks off, I have records pertaining to lead paint, or I have no records. So they check off, I have no records. Then there's a next question that says, I have given the buyer copies of all the records that I have. And then the second one is, I have no records to give the buyer. We are supposed to have the seller check off, if they have no records, that they have also given the buyer all the records that they have.
Which is none.
Makes no sense to me. Because there's also a question that says, I have no records to give the buyer.
Well, you realize these are written by attorneys, right?
Yes, I do. Okay. And I also know the fines on the lead paint disclosure, if they are filled out incorrectly, are $10,000 per error. Wow. So you could make 3 mistakes on the form, and that's a $30,000 fine. They take that seriously.
Oh, I'm sure they do.
Yeah, so I usually, like almost every time I have to take continuing ed, I include the lead paint class. And like I said, I still don't understand it, but I follow it. All right. Then general information. So one of the questions always is this property subject to liens, encroachments, easements, right-of-ways, leases, covenants, attachments, life estates, or right of first refusal? Some people will check off yes and say, well, we have a mortgage on it, which is a lien. And that's a correct answer to that question.
I guess it is. Yeah.
But most people say no because I think it's really getting at, is there something out of the ordinary?
Right, and that's what they're assuming too,
Yeah.
which is probably the case.
Right. What would an encroachment be?
It'd be your neighbor built a barn or a garage that goes over your property line a couple feet, or
it's encroaching.
It's encroaching on your property, and you may or may not know about it. Right. But if you do know about it, that's where you're supposed to disclose it.
Exactly. Another one on here, I'm going to pick this form apart, I apologize. Is this property located in a federally designated flood zone? It's a yes or no question, and people say no if they're in the low-risk flood zone. But the thing is we are all in a flood zone. The map has put everybody in a flood zone. It's just there are high risk versus low risk.
Yeah, most people are in X, or
right, exactly,
which is under 500 years. Or
I'm just saying, maybe the next thing I volunteer for is to be on the forms committee.
Okay.
I really wish that people would fill out annual fuel consumption on the heating system section, because everybody always asks.
Yeah, you don't see it often, but
right.
But some people know. Some people just, they have all the records right there in front of them, and they're happy to do that.
And I found it. Here's where they added the solar panel question. They didn't add a separate section for it. They put it under heating system. So solar panels, are they leased or owned? And explain terms of the agreement. So roof age, roof covering, moisture or leakage. Roof covering, I see everybody refer on their forms, I'm generalizing, on their forms and in MLS to asphalt shingles, and they're usually not.
I know, it's just a term that's been used forever.
They're architectural shingles, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're usually composite or fiberglass or something,
yeah. But everybody just always says asphalt.
Yeah, we've been using it forever.
Exactly, but it's not usually what they actually are. So the most scrutinized question, I would say, by both buyers and sellers is there moisture or leakage in the basement?
Or more importantly, mold.
Or mold, yes. Which there's no mold question on here.
No, and that would generally be, most of the time it's in the attic.
Yeah. I think the reason why, I'm going to speculate here, but I think the reason why there's not a mold question on there is because there's a lot of different types of mold.
Yeah.
And there's no one standard as to what's good mold or bad mold. It's how sensitive or allergic you are to it.
Right. We've always heard, the black mold.
The black mold or whatever. Yeah. But the thing is when I've had a house have mold testing, you get back like a sheet with like 15 to 20 different types of mold.
Right. And unless you're an expert, you don't know.
And you might be allergic to one and I might be sensitive to another. True. So it's an individual thing. It's not a standard thing that's the same for everybody.
But I think the main thing is here, do you know there's presence of what is likely mold.
Right, but there's no question about it. Yeah. There's nothing on the form to address that.
And we're not going to be putting that here in the additional comments section.
Well, if you'd had mold remediation.
Oh, yes, I suppose.
If you'd had mold remediation,
yes.
you should put that in a disclosure and have a copy of the invoice.
Yeah.
And then have a copy of their guarantee or warranty.
Sure.
Yeah. So moisture leakage in the basement, I think sellers need to be very honest about that. And I think buyers also need to realize that there is sometimes seepage.
Yeah, the famous Mother's Day flood. I don't even remember what year it was now.
We were in Florida, of course.
But, almost everyone got water in their basement, whether they've never gotten water in their basement prior or after that.
Well, our house is a case in point.
No, we had...
You had a little in the garage, right?
It was 2006.
Oh,
Thank
it was?
you.
You remember? Yeah.
No, I got the
you
Googles.
looked it up. Okay.
But almost everyone got water in their basement.
Right.
So it's just a matter, is it a problem that's occurring every year?
Well, our current house has a super dry basement because 3/4 of it is above grade.
But I did get...
But you did
I got
get water.
like 3 feet of water in the corner of my garage in 2006 during that storm.
But you're not saying 3 feet high. You're saying you had a puddle that's 3 feet wide.
Exactly. So, so that's the difference, obviously. But you should disclose that, though.
You should absolutely disclose that. Another question that I get from people is, if I had a leak and I fixed it, what should I say? And my personal take on this is if it's just a normal maintenance thing, you don't really have to disclose it. So if you had a toilet seal that you had to replace, that's kind of a maintenance thing. It's like if you have a car and you need to do your brakes or your muffler or whatever. But if you had mold in your attic and you had that remediated, that's a little out of the ordinary. I think you should disclose it. I think you should have the paperwork.
Sure.
If you put in a French drain and a full basement waterproofing system,
provide the paperwork.
Provide the paperwork, because that goes beyond just normal maintenance type of stuff.
It's actually a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's a nice bold disclaimer on here to the buyer to say that, hey, the seller has told you some things about the house, but now you need to exercise your due diligence and investigate it. And you should exercise whatever due diligence you deem necessary with respect to adjacent parcels. And you should exercise whatever due diligence you deem necessary with respect to information on any sexual offenders, because the seller's disclosure is just about the property and what's on their property. So it doesn't give you any information about what's going on in the neighborhood, highway construction, airports.
Yeah, generally we refer to it as an area disclosure.
Yes, which we have.
Which we have a form that we include. But yes, it goes over notice of airports in the vicinity, flood hazard zones, which you already went into.
Yeah.
The Megan's Law, which is for the sex
offenders
list, and generally we'll refer people to websites so they can do their own research on these particular items.
Right, because nobody's going to disclose that information to you. It's not on the seller's disclosure.
Exactly, and I-93 in our area has been. They've been working on it forever.
Yes, expanding all the bridges and adding lanes.
But you can go to the website and you can find out exactly what's planned and when they expect to be completed, and then add on about 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, people buy homes and then they get upset to find out that they're near the dump or that they're in the flight path.
Right. So you need to know those.
That's not going to be on the disclosure statement because it's not on that individual property. So that's something that, if you're going to buy a house, go visit it at different times of day.
Right.
If you are selling a condominium, there will be an additional page added to the disclosure where you need to give information on what the fees cost, who the management company is, who the master insurance policy holder is.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we mentioned the meth.
Yep.
So what about other crimes that might have happened on the property or...
Yeah, it's interesting that on the disclosure here it said something about felony, but again, it's not related to the property, it's related to the people.
Right.
And so things related to the people are not usually disclosed. Usually what's disclosed are things that are...
Because they're not running with the property
specific. So. I will recommend people go ahead and, check with the local police department if they're concerned about crime. And I sometimes will get asked, do you know if anybody died in this house? No, I don't know if anybody died in this house.
But if you did, you would have to disclose
But
that.
if I did, I would have to disclose it. And then, but if it's a real concern for people, usually death certificates are public information through the local town hall.
Yeah.
I find more people die at hospitals than in the house, though. So.
And on that
on that note.
Great note there.
Well, thank you so much for getting real about real estate with Brian and Jen as we talk about property disclosures and not the people.
Oh.
Music courtesy of the Eric Lindbergh Trio. Please visit his website at www.ericlindberghworld.com. Jennifer and Brian are licensed to practice real estate in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Brian is also a certified general appraiser in New Hampshire. They are not lawyers, accountants, home inspectors, or therapists. Real estate customs and rules may be different in your area. Each Keller Williams Realty office is independently owned and operated. The realtor name is trademarked to members of the National Association of Realtors. If you are currently under contract with a real estate agent, this is not intended as a solicitation. Views expressed on this podcast by Jennifer may not be shared by Brian and vice versa, nor are they necessarily the views of Keller Williams Realty.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21, Podcast Café, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.